So last Friday, Tom Warren from Verge and other outlets started reporting about Xbox and Windows NT source code leaks. These leaks, I believe, is a part of ongoing leaks that are coming from 4chan. We reported on Nintendo leaks just a couple of weeks ago. Now, I got a ton of requests to cover the Xbox leaks, and I'm going to tell you guys what this is. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, first of all, the article itself talks about the Xbox source code leak that includes the kernel for the operating system, the Xbox operating system, and other goodies. Then Tom goes on to discuss that the Xbox OS leaks also includes build environments, the Xbox development kit, emulators used for testing, and internal documents. And we understand that this kernel and source code has been passed around privately amongst enthusiasts previously. So I'm going to get to that part later on in this episode. So what does this all mean, and will it actually help with emulation? Original Xbox emulation, as we know, has had a very difficult road. So does this imply that this leak will help with the emulation people at all? Well, I would say it's unlikely. Now, while some of the source code for the kernel may provide answers, I think in general, the problems don't necessarily lie with emulation of the kernel. It's more centered around the custom chips like the MCPX, the NVIDIA NV2A, understanding things like the system management controller in more detail, and providing a solid low-level emulation path to actually get there. But we're certainly not downplaying this leak. There's still quite a bit of stuff here. First, there's the entire source code tree for the Xbox kernel, including all the lower level drivers and libraries that it uses. It's all here. You get the CD file system, the FATX file system, IDE drivers, the system management controller code, the boot startup process, the hardware application layer, the modified Windows 2000 code, DirectX 8, and more. It's absolutely all here. Everything to build an Xbox kernel that you could potentially flash and run on a modified Xbox console. There's also source code for storage, including memory units, test applications for controllers, the entire source code for the DVD player that's included with the Xbox, as well as the source code that is used on the DVD dongle device. And there's many test satellite applications that developers have put together to test a lot of this functionality out. You can tell that this was very early on in the Xbox's life cycle, pretty much before the release of the actual system, because a lot of this stuff goes back to the early 2000s, and some of it even before that. But of course, that isn't the end of the story. There's also some interesting stuff going on here. There is a port of Quake to the original Xbox that I can only assume was some kind of proof of concept. This was developed by Jack Pavlich. Now, Jack had made a version of Quake that previously ran on Windows known as D3D or Direct 3D Quake. And this is essentially a port of D3D Quake that ran on the Xbox hardware. There's also XNES, a Nintendo NES emulator, and X-Atari, an Atari 800 emulator. So developers were looking at ways to run emulation internally, which is interesting. Now, none of these amounted to anything other than proof of concepts, but it was also interesting that the homebrew community took the same ideas as kind of these internal developed emulators and ran with them. Now, there's also the full source code to the DVD player application that was a part of the original Xbox that wouldn't work without the dongle device. And there's also a test app that checks for the presence of a dongle and downloads the player application that's installed onto the flash. And there's source code that's relating to building numerous Xbox utilities like the CD-ROM format, audio, samples, and more. Now, much of this stuff is developers working on little proof of concept applications and test applications that just kind of sat in the source code repository, but really nothing really came out of many of these. But what's more interesting is the documentation around the Xbox, internal developer documents on best practices, how to use the hardware, installing and setting up. And again, many of these documents have made their way into the official SDK, but there's also some PowerPoint presentations that are more along the lines of sales pitches of the Xbox itself. For example, how to get development studios interested and the cost to develop games and its hardware. So that's all pretty interesting stuff. But here's the thing, guys. This leak is really nothing new. In fact, This is the exact same leak that has been around since 2002. Now, many of you know that the Xbox homebrew scene used the official Microsoft XDK for pretty much everything. Now, these XDKs were leaked onto the internet. This source code dump, this Xbox OS source code dump, was also leaked, but only to a selected few scene groups, and one of those groups was known as Complex. In fact, if you look at the files in the leak, there is a second file called cpxupd.rar or .rar. This is a complex release that they packaged together to provide updates and patches to the Xbox OS code. But MVG, I hear you ask, how can you prove any of this to be true? Well, it's very easy. If we go back to X-Quake, the port of Quake that was a part of the source dump, this port has been around the homebrew scenes since 2002. XNES, the Nintendo emulator, is also available on the homebrew circles. In fact, if you checked Xbins, a popular repository for the original Xbox homebrew, you'll find a copy of XNES, a compiled version of that same emulator, and it's dated 2002. It's the exact same emulator code. So that obviously tells us that this source code dump has been around for a while. One of the biggest hidden secrets about the original Xbox hacking scene has to do with custom firmwares. In the early days, when it was understood how to decrypt firmwares, it was able to be reversed quite easily, and small patches were applied to things like enabling the F drive, patching video settings, and other things. But let's be clear, this exact same source code leak has been around since 2002-2003, and when groups like Team Executor got a hold of it and understood how to build a firmware from source code, it meant they could add many more custom features. One of the more popular customizations was to change the intro animation sequence. This folder here, known as Annie2, handles the intro animation sequence. It's simple C++ and DirectX code, and everything is rendered as primitives in real time, which is something that Seamus Blackley also confirmed back in 2017. There was a binary of this animation code that was compiled up, and it was something that was passed around in private to show off how an intro animation could be manipulated. Note, there are different settings that can be adjusted, including being able to change the fog effect to a shield that spins around the flubber itself. Custom firmwares took full advantage of this leak to alter the intro animation, but they weren't able to deviate too far away from what was here due to size limitations, ensuring that the firmware was the right size and that the animation fit in the exact same section of code. Otherwise, it would not work. Again, this is more proof that this leak, while interesting, isn't anything new. Scene groups like Team Executor had access to the exact same source code as we're talking about here, and this is what they did to build custom kernels with. With this source code, it was discovered that you could compile up these boot animations and change the settings around with it. It was added to custom BIOSes, and this is why many boot animations are different, but they could never be drastically changed because of the file limitations of the kernel BIOS itself. So if we go back to the news articles, Engadget mentioned that the Xbox source leak could have some value and how it may help with emulation, while new discoveries are being made. But sadly, I don't believe this to be true. They rightly point out that this information has been around for years, and as we've seen, that is absolutely true, but the leak itself is mostly out of date anyway, going back to around 2002. By 2004-2005, the Microsoft original Xbox was much more mature, as well as the codebase and the XDKs. So most of this code found in the leak is already obsolete, but there's no doubt there's some interesting stuff in there. Seamus Blackley has mentioned for years that there is an Easter egg in the boot animation that no one has ever found. Perhaps this mystery can be solved. There's also some interesting info on Xbox's partnership with Sega and the Sega Chihiro arcade hardware that games were made for. There's also some interesting white papers and slide decks that discuss the Xbox in detail, everything from initial sales pitch decks to becoming a partner, purchase order forms for dev kits, and technical white papers on developing on the Xbox and how to get the best from it. But ultimately, I think that this leak is really nothing more than of interest to preservationists and fans of the Xbox. For emulation purposes, I don't really see much of value here. So there you have it, guys. That's pretty much the gist of these Xbox OS leaks. It's interesting, but there's really nothing new here that provides anything different than what many of the homebrew community have seen in the past, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about this Xbox OS leak? Do you think there's some cool stuff here? Have you taken a look at the files and maybe, you know, seen some interesting stuff? Let us know in the comments below. Well guys, that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.